Welcome to Interviews with the Contrarian. I'm Mark Milkey, president of the Aristotle Foundation for Public Policy. The Aristotle Foundation is a new public policy and educational think tank in Canada. We received our charitable designation in February. We champion reason, democracy, and civilization. There's a lot under that, and you can check out our website at aristotlefoundation.org, as well as our new book, The 1867 Project, Why Canada Should Be Cherished, Not Cancelled, by myself and 19 other authors. It's done very well. If you haven't bought a copy yet, you should. But today, I want to talk about a new book from a Canadian author, Michael Bonner, who I'll introduce in a moment. One of our goals at the Aristotle Foundation is to introduce reason and think about democracy and think about civilization, put it back in the lexicon, so to speak, but also have specific interviews with mainly Canadian authors and promote their work when we come across a gem. And Michael has written a gem of a book today, but let me just introduce him first. Michael Bonner is a Canadian political advisor and historian of Iran, and we'll get into that. He studied classical and Oriental languages in his undergraduate and took a master's degree and a doctorate in Iranian history from the University of Oxford. He has advised members of cabinet in both federal and provincial governments, and he lives in Toronto with his family, and he's got a new book out, In Defense of Civilization: How Our Past Can Renew the Present, published by Sutherland House here in Canada. Michael, thank you for joining Interviews with a Contrarian.
Pleasure. Thanks for having me, Mark.
Let's start off with the easy or obvious question. Why did you decide to write a book about a concept such as civilization, which in most people's cranium feels and sounds very old-fashioned? What prompted you to write a book about civilization?
It's a good question. I mean, there are two answers. The first one I'll say, it was early in 2020, right when things were sort of looking pretty rough out of Wuhan, and a friend of mine and I, we were lifting weights at the gym, and we were sort of talking about how upset we were. How, the state of the world was so dreadful. Sounded like this plague was coming, and then after a long pause, we realized that there was really nothing we could do but just get huge. So we sort of abandoned trying to fix the world's problems. Less facetiously, I would say that I had often wanted to come to terms with the subject myself, just in my own sort of thinking about what we mean when we say civilization, or when we talk about what is improving or what is declining in human history. What do we mean by that? And I've always wanted to sort of put it on more of a sort of anthropological basis, and participating in, or at least observing, sort of online arguments in the so-called trad movements.
What do you mean by trad movements?
Well, the sort of people who think that the world would simply be better if we just had more beautiful statues, or that if we could only make buildings the way we did 500 years ago, everything would be better. I think that we need to find a way of talking about those issues a little bit more seriously and a little bit more accurately. So the anthropological basis, I think, is really important there, but also just we need to understand that the decline, if we think things have declined, as I do, we need to understand really where that came from, how old it is, what caused it, and I don't think it's of recent origin. So sitting down to put my thoughts on paper, read up about the subject, as I was doing that, there was also a plague. The COVID pandemic was unfolding in the background, and all of those sort of factors and influences came together and seemed to be the right thing to do to sort of make sense of what was going on.
So you mentioned decline of civilizations, and I think people are generally aware that these happen, but of course it's a bit like being 20 years old and never thinking you'll get into a car wreck yourself, right? Because you're invincible at age 20. Yeah. You never think the decline of a civilization will happen to yours. at least in any grand way, where it will literally quite end, and you'll be, homeless and poor and a refugee crossing borders or some such thing. And in the West, perhaps in particular, we haven't experienced this, or at least not since World War II. So can you give us some thoughts, and we'll get into how you define civilization or the principal features in a moment, and some other aspects of your book. But can you give some evidence or thoughts? You talk about the decline that you see in civilization, and by that, my guess is you probably mean the West, particular, or the Anglosphere, or Canada, depending on how specific you want to give it. What are some signs of what you think is a decline in civilization around us, or in ours?
Yeah, so I think that what you said initially is exactly right. That there is this, looking at the broader picture of history, there is something more like a cycle, that we don't have the Akkadian or Sumerian civilizations anymore. They're gone. But there have been subsequent sort of cycles of collapse and rebirth in ancient Mesopotamia and so forth. And we don't think about time in that way anymore, or we don't think about the sort of the rise and fall of civilizations or cultures, or political orders, or really anything nowadays. I think we might think about sort of cycles in the economy. I think people talk about that still, but it was certainly very unfashionable in the late 80s and throughout the 1990s, when I was growing up, to consider the possibility that the way things were then might not be the way they will be in the future, that the prospect that things would actually deteriorate, or somehow ways of life would disappear, or so forth, that was not really considered. And of course, you have this sort of caricature of the Francis Fukuyama idea that nobody has to do anything, history is just sort of unfolding, and we're just, everything's going to be better and better and better. And of course, when we talk about decline, we have to face the fact that that simply isn't the way things have turned out. There's no question about sort of technological improvement, like I'm not going to argue with that, but I don't think that that's entirely, that's certainly not the be all and the end all of what we mean when we talk about civilization, and it may not actually be relevant. The fact that your cell phone is now smaller, and that it has more features than it did in 1995, it doesn't really have any bearing on the fact that life expectancies in America have begun to shorten, that heights are going into reverse in America and not elsewhere, or that suicide is on the rise, that we build ugly buildings that sort of are consistently rejected by the public. There are many different ways that you could look at decline, but I would say simply overall, at this point in the history of my own life, the promises that we heard in the 1990s about a new world of cultural exchange, prosperity, and the spread of liberal democracy, it just hasn't come to pass. So we're not at the point where we're talking about people hiding out in the ruins of old buildings, that's, or at least not in this part of the world. But given the longer time frame, we should probably begin to face the possibility that our civilization is just as fragile as all the other ones were. And again, with the background of economic collapse and pandemic, maybe now's a good time to remember that.
You're onto something, Michael, because I remember the 1980s, which shows a little bit of how old I am, and the 1990s. And I remember Francis Fukuyama, and I was an undergrad when his essay came out, and then later his book. And I hope I'm describing it correctly, but as I recall, you're right. There was a sort of interpretation of his theory of the end of history, and he wasn't saying history would stop, But at that point, he said there were no competitors to Western liberalism. And perhaps it was an optimistic but understandable thesis at that point, because really the West and others who were involved in the fight had just spent 50 to 70 years, depending on the country, fighting Marxism around the world.
Yeah.
And that free markets and the triumph of the individual and all of that, and forms of democracy seemed to have triumphed. And there seemed to be a nice time to take a breath, right? And even Russia, the Soviet Union collapse, was in large measure a good thing. So these repressive regimes around the world began to unpack themselves, and mostly peacefully, not entirely, but mostly, which was quite remarkable. So there was a reason for optimism. But I do remember he basically said he didn't really see any challengers on the scene. And so he underestimated what would come, 10 to 15 years later in the form of Vladimir Putin and a power-seeking tyrant, as Walter Newell would describe him. Or perhaps the rise of fundamentalist Islam, which was already around, but we weren't really paying attention to until 9/11 as a competitor for attention, right? A competitor for meaning. So, and for Western liberalism. So, I mean, if I may, it sounds like what you're saying is it was nice that markets triumphed, but man doesn't live by data or material gains alone. There's something else that we're seeking, and markets alone, the freedom. I mean, I'm a big believer in the freedom to trade. I think there's reasons why that's important, but it's not. It doesn't define your civilization enough or alone, and there's more to it. It's a means to an end.
Yes.
So with that, let's jump into how you define civilization, or three factors. The first you say in your book is clarity, then beauty, and then order. But before we go there, let's deep into a little bit of how you view history. Because in the early part of your book, you talk about big history and the deep currents and the long-term trends, and then civilization and religion. So do you see, first of all, you're obviously trying to get this is the point of the book, is to look at long-term trends and remind us that long-term trends, or this has happened before. But let's start there with long-term trends, and then also the influence of religion on civilization.
Yeah, so civilization, what the way I use the term, you have to think, I'm not talking about things like nice manners or, elaborate columns or, sort of white marble. That's not what I mean. What I mean is the shift that occurs in at the end of the Ice Age, when human beings go from one of the longest periods of our history in which we were wandering around, we were, hunter-gatherers, and we stopped that and we settled down. And this change, as far as we can tell, happened really quite quickly in the long term of our existence. And that you can recognize the change, or the change is symbolized in the material culture that is produced, and we'll come on to that in a second. But it's important to understand and emphasize that from, say, the earliest civilizations, take Sumer or dynastic Egypt, from then until now, this is a blink of an eye in comparison with the time we spent in the Paleolithic era, or the Upper Paleolithic, 40,000 years, during which there was plenty of art, there was plenty of musical instruments were made at that time. There's evidence of quite extraordinary cave art. I think a lot of people have probably seen in southern France and in Spain and elsewhere in Australia, probably elsewhere. There's probably Africa. There are probably places we haven't even seen yet. But this is not to say that civilization is somehow coterminous exclusively with creativity, because it isn't. Because there's more there's more to judge by time, at least. There's more time spent on art and music and so forth in the very, very remote past. But the art looks different after human beings have decided to settle down. Why did they settle down? Well, one of the most compelling reasons that I notice in the book is this idea of shared ancestry. that this doesn't seem to have been an idea that was known or understood in the very remote past, or if it had occurred to anybody, it didn't matter. But at some point after the Ice Age, it did matter, and people start setting up these sort of public shrines. You might even go as far to say there's sort of outdoor temples, sort of like Stonehenge-looking stone structures where all evidence seems to point to a cult of ancestry, that ancestors' skulls were kept there and venerated in some fashion that we can't reconstruct, but we know from the archaeological evidence that that's what they did. Seems kind of grim by our standards, but that's what was done. And later on in the Near East, by the way, the site that I'm describing there is a place called Göbekli Tepe in southern Turkey. That's one of the oldest sites. As far as I know, there are older sites that are being investigated, but none quite as deeply as Göbekli Tepe, and it's about 11,000 BC we're talking about, so literally right after the end of the Ice Age. Elsewhere, you find places like, well, throughout the Near East, but especially at a place called Çatalhöyük, also in southern Turkey, where the inhabitants have established, for as far as we could tell, basically the world's first town. And this town has a group of houses that are sort of all connected. It probably supported maybe 9 to 11,000 people. But the key fact is that the people who live there are burying their ancestors under their proverbial floorboards. They're living in these houses for hundreds of years, the same families, burying people underneath. And then every couple of generations, the whole house is stripped. Everything, all the wall art is taken down, the furniture is removed, the hearth taken out, and then everything is put back, fresh and new, exactly as it was, repainted, rebuilt. So what do you infer from this as an archaeologist, or just as based on what you might know about human beings? This means that there is a sense of permanence that has developed. And of course, each house in this in Çatalhöyük is unique. They're not all the same. They're not sort of copies of one another. Each has its specific little hunting trophies and wall art and so forth. So this is happening, this sense of permanence and shared ancestry linked to specific places. This has taken shape before agriculture. And that's the key. Before the full domestication of animals, they probably had dogs, but maybe they're not fully, they didn't have any sheep or anything like that. But they're not farming. And this completely refutes the idea that there is a technological change in the way we eat, or like an economic change in the sort of like mode of production, to use a Marxist term, that gave us agriculture, that then compels people to settle down. That isn't what happened. We settle down first. And that presupposes a fundamental change of outlook. And you might ask something like, well, what caused the change of outlook? I think it's religion. I think that people have developed, a new attitude to ancestor worship, veneration of people who came before, and that this is the impetus for what we call civilization.
So the veneration of ancestors really is maybe the first bit of evidence, or the first, bit of something that signifies we're looking for something outside of ourselves, or we believe there's something outside of ourselves, or we're trying to, we're kind of progressing from the apes, not thinking about this, and so on and so forth, to where we think there's something valuable. And literally they're building their foundations on their ancestors. But this veneration really is the first glimpse of religion. That's the word I'm looking for. The first, sign that, faith is emerging, some sort of faith, some sort of religious belief is emerging. You think that started with the veneration of the ancestors?
I think so, because people have theorized about a Paleolithic religion, and maybe there was one, but it doesn't really come through very clearly. And these are anatomically, these are human beings just like ourselves. There's no anatomical biological difference. Our Homo sapiens is about 80,000 years old last time I checked, although some people push that date way further back, but that would only strengthen the idea that we're still looking at people who are fundamentally the same as ourselves. In which case, we would have to wonder, why are those images that we find in the cave paintings, why do they not speak to us as clearly as those of early civilization? Why is that? Something has changed. And people have thought maybe the religion of the Paleolithic is something like shamanism, or and there may be some truth to that, but I don't know if we'll ever really be able to tell. But there are no Paleolithic images of groups of people. There are no images of, say, families or tribes, nothing like that. And the images of people that, or sort of anthropoid images that do occur, they're either sort of not very interesting stick figures, or they're kind of blends of human-like forms and animal forms, whereas the animals are very realistically and energetically depicted. I think that must tell you something about.
And sorry, what does that tell you about what you think the artist was thinking in that particular case, or pre-civilization? What was going on with that sort of mixture of man and animal?
I would like to infer from that our place and purpose in the world was not entirely clear, and I think that you can associate, in my train of thought, I think that fits well with the idea of hunter-gatherers. They move from place to place. Their sort of relationship with whatever their sort of spiritual world was like, and with the what would you say, the territory that they moved through, it's sort of brief, not particularly strong attachments and so forth. But there's a sense in which we can, we're very much guessing with the Paleolithic world. When people have settled down, we're no longer guessing. It's clear. We are seeing the presentation of stable, rooted societies and images of very obvious narrative content.
Let's segue then from that to your three principal features and outcomes of civilized life, which you refer to as clarity, beauty, and order. We can unpack all of this over the next 40 minutes or so still. And I want to get into some other parts of the book where you bring all of this out. But can you briefly describe what clarity, beauty, and order, what you mean by that, why you think they're necessary for the civilized life? And of course, you point out, you go into various aspects or examples of civilization, from China and India to others. So I think often today people think of civilization, they think it's Europeans playing up just their own past or what they think is their own past. But you go into, of course, various civilizations in history, and you identify these three principal features: clarity, beauty, and order. So can you touch on that and kind of how you came to conclude that those are the three principal features of civilizations?
Yeah, so exactly. The idea for me had to be, I needed a way to really drive home the idea of a single, a single principle of civilization that then gives rise to, multiple civilizations. We don't have really a way of sort of, I don't know if any language has a good way of sort of distinguishing those two ideas. that they all have sort of different, they're expressing slightly different tastes, or there's this sort of somewhat different aesthetic values, or whatever, but nevertheless that they are all recognizably animated by the same the same principles. So I needed sort of convenient rubrics to sort of get at that, so that, as you say, China, India, Rome, Persia, these could all be somehow compared. So I looked at the art and material culture of the earliest civilizations. I looked at dynastic Egypt, Old Kingdom Egypt, and the sort of the images and the figurines that you see inside the earliest tombs. You see, the carving of the hieroglyphs that are, a combination of, good wishes and spells and so forth, but also there are lists of kings and officials and records of deeds and so forth, very, very clearly and precisely and elegantly laid out on the wall. And of course, the writing system is expressed through images, not through representations of sounds, which I think is critical. Then you have the depiction of nature, and human beings interacting with animals and plants and so forth, and everything is sort of harmoniously laid out. And depictions of the gods, depictions of people just going about their daily affairs. They seem cheerful and intelligent. The bureaucrats look serious and poised and focused, and they're holding their pens and everything. And the human and animal figures are drawn in highly idealized ways. You might say that they're unrealistic, the way Egyptian art is, but they're nevertheless drawn according to specific mathematical proportions. And that this is my idea of beauty. So the whole sort of vision of this society, I think, is summed up in those three things: that you have clarity, the world and the activities of people are easily and clearly understood and conveyed from one person to another.
Sorry, and by that you mean there's a set understanding, a common civilizational or societal understanding, which is part of the civilizational ethos. The clarity. There's clarity about what it means to be an Egyptian or the gods in ancient Egypt. I mean, there's clarity about what those are. There's wide agreement on that.
There's an assumption that you can look at the world and explain it to someone else.
Okay.
Which is if you compare that to, say, the postmodernist vision of the world, right. They don't think that. Right. But looking at Egyptian material culture, I think I see that. Then the concept of beauty they express through mathematical proportion. It's not about what is necessarily attractive or somehow enticing to the eye. It's or like sort of like physically erotic. It's not that. It's that there is a canon of proportions that make for a pleasing and harmonious artwork. Mm-hmm. And finally, order is the sense that there's a place and purpose for everything in the world, and that there is both a seen and an unseen order. The seen order is what we would now call politics, and the unseen is religion. So I think that those things sort of first, you can see them coming together and taking shape in the very earliest civilized art, but they have reached a state of perfection in Egyptian and later Mesopotamian art. And I use those three rubrics to look at our own civilization and those that came after the earliest ones.
Let's go with art then for a moment, because is that evidence today of a bit of decline? And you mentioned earlier you don't want to be simplistic about it, like somebody looks like an ugly building and says that's evidence of decline. But is there something to the notion that whether it's architecture or art, that some of the ugliness we see today, and the unwillingness, lack of desire to create beauty, is evidence of the problem? Decline of civilization may be too strong, but I'm just thinking about it was either Paul Johnson or the other English fellow, the other English fellow I've forgotten, Roger, I've forgotten his last name, Scruton. One of them, I can't remember which, made this observation many years ago. And it was that their theory, or whoever it was that came up with this, was one of them, I believe, thought that if you had an ordered life personally, say as a young person in a family, you might be, more attracted to, chaos or art because you could take the risk. If you came out of a chaotic situation, you found refuge in what we call more traditional art or beauty. Really, I don't know if that's true, but it does seem to me that, when I've gone to the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City or elsewhere, people are drawn to proportions. They're drawn to what we call the more traditional art. Whereas when I went into the modernist wing, or the avant-garde wing of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, it was pretty empty. And we keep being told, and it's the same with architecture. I watched a series last week that mentioned the same thing, that the average person likes what we would call beautiful architecture. It's symmetrical, proportion, that sort of thing. But if you're in architectural school, the longer you're in there, the more you will favor the avant-garde or the chaotic. I don't know if this is a decline of civilization, but it says something that you have to, who was it? It said, it was Orwell that said, it was intellectuals. I'm paraphrasing, will believe almost anything. I forget the exact phrase. Same with art and architecture. You have to be trained into the chaotic. Most people just look and can recognize something. And the series that I watched even last week pointed out that this is neurological. We favor order, which would seem to favor your point that part of a civilization, there's this order component, and it shows up even in art and architecture, or should.
Yes. So let's give the early modern artists the benefit of the doubt. Picasso and Braque and Kandinsky and company, they were trying to wrestle with a world which in their perception, and I think in the perception of many other people, had become chaotic and disorderly and even worse than all that, unintelligible. And they found support for that in the ideas of Einstein and in other aspects of sort of cutting edge physics. And they wanted to depict this world of four dimensions and sort of energy being converted into matter and back again, and then later on, when what is it called, quantum mechanics came along, that seemed to introduce even more weirdness and strange contradictions, which led to art becoming even weirder and more disorderly. Now that kind of tendency is over 100 years old, and it's become, I think, kind of static, stereotyped. They're rehashing the same thing over and over again, and there's no longer any kind of spirit to it. I personally, I'm not really a big fan of Picasso, but I kind of see where he's getting at, where he's coming from, what he's getting at. That spirit I sense is gone. So why has this changed? Again, if you don't believe that the world is somehow coherent, or if you've convinced yourself that you cannot understand it, you will depict it accordingly. It will seem it will seem to you chaotic and confusing and weird, and you will draw it that way. Now, I had one reviewer who looked at my book and he thought this was insane. Like, it's not insane. Like, the artists themselves wrote about this. They talked about Einstein. They talked about Niels Bohr and the atomic, the Bohr-Rutherford model of the atom, and later on chaos theory and all like this stuff. But it's well beyond me to understand it. But they talked about it. It influenced them in exactly the same way that medieval architects, because like visual art in the Western Middle Ages is not quite where most of the feeling was, but in medieval architecture and music, you had the same kind of discussion of sort of cosmic harmonies, and the theory of the music of the spheres and the sort of Pythagorean proportions, and they viewed the whole universe. People like Hildegard of Bingen, or what's his name? The John Scotus Eriugena. These is very sort of obscure medieval people, but they wrote about the universe as sort of, they compared it to a kind of stringed instrument where each string vibrated according to a different pitch, and that the whole thing working properly was a sort of harmony. This is ultimately a Pythagorean idea, but it's the idea of proportion and harmony, right? Proportion and harmony. And one of the weird things about this is that the proponents of string theory, who purport to sort of reconcile the tensions between Einsteinian physics and quantum mechanics and so forth, that they're also presupposing this world of vibrating strings, or this universe of vibrating strings. And again, people say, I'm not competent to evaluate whether string theory is true or not, but what you have here, if we're lucky, is this theory of a harmonious universe coming back full circle. So an
attempt to establish art on the basis of, as opposed to faith or religion before, an understanding of the universe through a different sort of lens. Is that kind of what you're thinking? They're thinking.
Yeah, I mean, if people could convince themselves that, say, or like if something like, if the contradictions between the various sort of physical understandings of the world and mathematical understandings of it, if they could be somehow harmonized or sort of reconciled, we might have a new more beautiful school of art. But I think that until that happens, or unless that happens, or if we can somehow otherwise convince ourselves that we can see and observe a coherent and orderly universe, I don't think we're going to get back to, or put it this way, I don't think we're going to break out of this sort of like rehashing of modernist art. But you mentioned architecture. Architecture is a different story, because people, as you say, they consistently say that they prefer traditional architecture, and there's no better test for that than looking at the kind of buildings that people actually live in, right? Domestic architecture has not really changed, at least in this part of the world. It hasn't really changed that much. There are modernist houses that are sort of these ugly cubes made of concrete and glass or whatever, but that's kind of rare.
So people crave order, and it shows up in their personal lives.
I believe so, but for some reason it doesn't. It's not matched by most institutional or public architecture. And you did have sort of you think about like the Art Deco tradition of skyscrapers in America. Those are built on a truly monumental, gigantic scale. which can be can seem overwhelming, but there's still an incredible refinement of detail there that shows shows a sense of pride and permanence, and that these things were built to last and so forth.
Right.
That might be a place where we could sort of pick up where we left off. But I am somewhat more optimistic about the prospects of an architectural revival, simply because we don't really have a choice. You don't have to surround yourself with statues. Most people can't, but you do have to live some.
Right. Art Deco is actually my favorite architectural period. I love Art Deco, precisely because it's got order and beauty, right? The 3 and the 5 and the intricate designs you mentioned. So you touched on one of my favorite types. But let's get into, or let's go back to then, collapse, because I want to try and draw these various threads together, because if art has become chaotic over the last century, and to some degree architecture, or at least public architecture, it seems to me part of it, again, is a departure from order, but also perhaps a departure from reality in terms of more extreme architecture. I mean, in your book, you mentioned one example of a house built that rained within the first couple of days because, it was a house from Le Corbusier. Am I pronouncing his name right? Le Corbusier? I always forget.
That's right. Yeah.
And his influence in architecture. But to tie in the collapse or the decline of art and architecture to some degree, to also the rise of disorder in society, and in the last 40 years in particular, perhaps since the end of the Cold War, 30 years since the end of the Cold War in the West, and the woke movement. As much as I dislike cliches, for lack of a better term, kind of woke ideology, right? And that's perhaps the best way to describe it. Are we not at a point where, so if you collapse order, you don't believe in order, and the traditional faiths have declined, and you can use the examples that you use in your book, whether it's China or Persia, or the Muslim period, from the apogee of the heights of the golden age of Islam, or Christianity now, whatever culture or civilization you want to choose. Are we in a period where, again, the traditional decline of the Western traditional religion, Christianity, inspired by Judaism, and its decline has now led us into a place where we have, woke folk, for lack again of a better term, that need to believe something. They need to be passionate. They want some order. They're trying to impose it, perhaps, but they're also revolutionary. They don't respect the past. They're not building on the past, much like art or architecture, which is experimental. It's fun when you're really in a safe society and you can experiment a little bit 100 years ago. Yeah. But now when you're experimenting in mores or your physical gender, and you're not 40 and 45 years old and have thought about this forever and really want to change your gender, but you're 15 and you're told that this is possible, perhaps desirable. Is that all not evidence from art or architecture to treating the physical body in the way we do, that there's a bit of a revolutionary anti-reality impulse, which is run amok, and it's combined, my theory, for what it's worth, Michael, is that it's combined with the good thing out of the Western tradition, which is the value of the individual. The individual can be whatever she wants to be. She can, kind of start again. This is a good thing. It's part of the Western tradition, but it's gone to, not an extreme is the wrong way to put it, but the notion of the individual, which we value, has combined with some sort of anti-reality, revolutionary impulse, whether it's art, architecture, or in society at large these days. Is that part of what's happening? And is that what you would identify as part of the decline, at least in the West?
Yeah, broadly
a lot there, but if you can unpack that.
Yes, well, indeed. Yes, so there is a tendency to place a great deal of emphasis on the individual's on individual moral agency in the West. That is true. I don't think that we're entirely alone in that, but it has certainly made that doctrine, or I don't know if it's really necessarily a doctrine.
Belief, bias.
Yeah, it's like an assumption. Yeah, about like an axiom that I think that it has been emphasized in the West a great deal. not just in our age. I think that there are former times where it became highly exaggerated. When you have Descartes talking about, deducing every, I forget his exact phrase, deducing sort of clear and distinct ideas and, metaphysical certainty simply by his own private reflections or sort of internal thoughts. You have a sense of that there too. There are also sort of later traditions that come after the Industrial Revolution, and people like Bergson, or Walt Whitman, talking about sort of like people basically kind of constructing their own sort of mental world,
their own reality. Well, let me,
yeah.
So, but to really drive it home, is the problem though the notion that we should look at people as individuals? I mean, I've argued this forever. We should look at people as individuals in law and policy, and it's one of the great accomplishments of the Anglosphere, for example. There's nothing wrong with that, to treat a woman and man as equal in terms of the voting booth and suffrage and the rest of it. But has the problem become that this individualism, which we I think rightly value in the liberal tradition, now perhaps called the small c conservative tradition, has somehow attached itself or been subverted by an anti-reality belief, right?
Yeah, and I think that it's
right. that in your book, the collapse of a common ethos. 3,000 years ago, 10,000 years ago, it was worshiping one's ancestors. Today, it's the decline of a religion, right? The pagan religion in Rome, or Christianity now, or maybe some clerics in Iran, or that's what's driving them, because they see it as a collapse in their society, as opposed to letting people breathe a little bit more than they have let them in the last 40 years. Is that part of it? Sorry, not to digress, but is that what's happening? Is the worthy notion of the individual has been attached to some anti-reality ideologies that in fact are not good for the individual, perhaps, and certainly not good for those around the individual, the family, the neighborhood, the city, the country writ large?
Yes. And the retreat, again, we can give the benefit of the doubt that if you had grown up most of your life thinking in the early 20th century that technological progress was sort of inexorable, and then everything was getting better and better and better, and that there had been peace in Europe since Napoleon, and then you lived through the First World War, your only option might have been to sort of retreat further into yourself, to construct kind of potentially irrational or sort of unreal alternative to.
Sorry, so the chaos of World War I and what it brought, you're saying, provoked a necessary retreat into the self.
Potentially.
I can't control the society around me, but perhaps I can create beauty or order in my own life.
I think some people might have thought that way, and of course, then you had another war. I mean, the experience of the 20th century is in many ways the experience of many letdowns and failures. And one era that you can also compare it to would be the 17th century, with the sort of massive social breakdowns that produced the English civil wars and the 30 Years' War, and the tail end of the French wars of religion. And then at that time, you also have people talking about how the only the only thing that is certain is the individual man, and that although it's obviously both Roman Catholics and Protestants at the time would have agreed about personal individual moral agency, that you would have had a tendency to exaggerate it to the point of antisocial behavior, people sort of locking themselves up in towers and only reading books and not seeing anybody, or trying to create these sort of thought worlds like Descartes, just in their own minds. I think that has reached like a pretty grim point now, and it has been abetted by not simply the earlier ideas of subjectivity, but also an extreme form of skepticism and complete sort of anti-intellectualism in the form of postmodernism, post-structuralism, that kind of thing. That this outlook on life can lead people, well, it might not necessarily be the cause, but it's certainly the justification for people constructing these sort of completely irrational and false visions of how to live basically entirely on their own. There are also ideas attributed to John Rawls, the idea of the inner self, which is obviously, I mean, I don't really agree about this idea of the inner self, but it crops up in all kinds of odd ways. Self-identification, radical, the ability to really sort of radically reshape your identity, or the forcing the world around you to conform to your own ideas. This is how a lot of people talk or appear to live, and it clearly militates against any shared sense of humanity, any kind of common, as I would say, civilization, any kind of shared human experience being communicated from one person to another. It implies that only people with sort of private subjective experiences of certain cultural things or particular ideas can hold them, and that others who are not from that tradition cannot participate. Cultural appropriation.
Right. When in fact, throughout history, it seems like a lot of the advances, if I can use that term, and I think it's correct, have been a result of shared cultural practices, right? Or learning from others, right? So Romans, we got rid of the Roman alphabet and adopted the, Arabic numbering, right? Roman numerals, and adopted Arabic numbering, which, allowed for all sorts of things from engineering to actuarial science, without which would be in a pretty pickle. But let's jump a little bit to, in the closing minutes, I think we've got about 10 or 15 minutes. You describe again sort of these various civilizations from Iran to China. Is there one that you'd like to focus on as an example of, okay, here's a civilization like Iran or China with clarity, beauty, and order. They declined, but then here's how they renewed. And are there lessons for that in terms of the West or the Anglosphere? Because your thesis is obviously we've got a little bit of a problem, and the chaos and the lack of order and the lack of beauty in wherever you look in the West, and certain things, art, architecture. I don't know. I wonder about the person who has too many nose rings or something and tattooed up to the yin yang. To me, there's a little lack of beauty there, but maybe I'm just being completely subjective. But I do wonder about this. But you're an expert in Iran, or you've studied about Iran. Do you want to use Iran or China, and describe decline and then renewal?
I want to use both, but
Okay.
for different reasons. So Iran is a great example of a place that, unlike our own Western tradition with sort of the Roman state, which had a very gradual rise and then a comparatively sudden collapse, at least in the West. In Iran, that has happened 3, arguably 4 times. The fourth time being the great golden age of Islam, as you said, which is basically once again centered on Iran. But you have these periods of sort of rising and falling and sort of interludes of political fragmentation and sort of cultural decay. But they've always managed to come back by trying to sort of reestablish the connection with the past and sort of revive the old empire. And as I say, that carried on. Like the Islamic Golden Age is a very interesting example because it carried on despite foreign conquest and despite the change of official religion.
So the idea is the idea is continued, or the civilization continued, much like you point out in the book, that the Huns conquer Rome, but they become Romans and defend Rome in one sense, Roman traditions and ideas. So the same thing happened in Iran.
Exactly. Now, China is different. China was also China was subject to foreign conquest more frequently, and they continued to sort of absorb their barbarians into the sort of wider and deeper stream of Chinese civilization. Most famously and most recently with the Qing, who were overthrown in 1908. They were of nomadic Manchurian origin, but nobody turned out to be more zealous, sort of more Chinese than the Chinese than they were. The Chinese vision of civilized order is fundamentally Confucian. Confucius was a bureaucrat, and apparently not a very successful one, but he was a bureaucrat nonetheless, who wanted to hark back to a much older time. He's writing in maybe 500 BC or so, and he's looking back to the very remote past, to an age before dynastic China, before the unification of China, and he's trying to sort of recreate what he thinks is a golden age, and that gets imitated all throughout Chinese history, right up to the fall of the empire. And of course, it's the Maoists who try to put a stop to that. Now, the example I want to give here is that despite the Chinese Cultural Revolution and the horrific damage done to it, the public repudiation of traditional Chinese religion and Confucius, and the grave of Confucius was notoriously ransacked, destroyed by the Red Guards. In more recent times, from the late 80s onward, there's been a sort of upward trajectory of the sort of revival of Buddhism and Confucianism, traditional Chinese spirituality.
So if I may, what you're saying in part is Marxism obviously wasn't enough, and with its collapse, quasi collapse, beyond the except for the control of the state, right, practically.
Yeah.
But Marxism as a theory or as a guide necessitated what was a long-standing aspect of Chinese civilization, which was Confucianism, and the desire to restore clarity about who we are. Say, if I was Chinese, to say who we are, and then the order and beauty that again to describe civilizations as needing. So there is this need for order, but obviously a need for clarity first, and out of that comes beauty. When they discovered again this Marxist import wasn't going to fit the bill, so to speak, for their civilization. So naturally, you have a revival of what happened in the past. Is that how it happens? And despite, by the way, I would say probably many, and I would guess your objections to say the current regime in Beijing, your point being these are long-term trends that reassert themselves because people want to believe in something deeper than the political people in power.
Yeah, I don't want to be carrying water for Xi Jinping, but the fact is that it's really him who gives the official sanction to the Confucian revival. But as I argue, I mean, he's pushing at an open door. That this has been bubbling up from the bottom for a long time, and he's riding on a trend when he comes out and he publicly praises Confucius and talks about the need for sort of rich spirituality within Chinese life. The problem with this, or at least you might frame it as an ideological challenge to us in the West, because if these ostensible Marxists are sitting around talking about Confucius and Buddhism and so forth, which seems to our way of thinking incoherent, and I think it demonstrably is to a certain extent. But if they can do that, why do we have such a challenge with our own tradition? Why is it so hard? I mean, I cannot imagine a Western leader. I cannot imagine Joe Biden talking about like Thomas Aquinas, or giving us a taste of his great respect for Peter Abelard or Aristotle or something. It just wouldn't happen. But it should happen. First of all, we should try to, we should have leaders who encourage us to learn from the past, and who want us to be informed by our traditions. And I would have hoped, I think my 1990s self would have hoped that at this point that the amount of cultural exchange that had occurred and the sort of the multicultural vision of the West would have helped us to re-engage with our own past and with the past of others. But I feel that hasn't happened. And if these people who call themselves Maoists can go about talking about their own ancient religious tradition and encouraging it, that doesn't really put us in a very good light. I would say, and I'm not naive about China. I think that the state is the Chinese state is demonstrably evil, but this is a place that sort of welds you into your apartment.
Literally, yes.
Yeah. So, but that's not the point. The point is that we in the West need to find a way to talk about the same kind of thing, and we're not there.
Well, the deep currents of history, which are and culture and religion, which are completely separate, or can be and should be from the state. I mean, the state is more ephemeral and temporary, right? In that sense, right, where the deep cultural and religious beliefs of a civilization are not, or it takes a very long time for them to change. In the closing minutes, then we've got just a couple of minutes, Michael. How does renewal usually happen? I mean, it can be, people can attempt from the top down, and perhaps that does happen in certain civilizations. I don't know. But when you observe, the renewal of Persian civilization, you said it happened 3 or 4 times, or Chinese civilization over the ages, or others. What seems to prompt a renewal of a particular civilization? And, the obvious question is there hope for kind of a renewal, in the sense that, Westerners or Canadians or whoever in the Anglosphere need to unite around a shared sort of set of assumptions and find clarity, beauty, and order. Again, how you define a civilization. So what have you observed from history, and what is the potential for, I guess you would, say Western civilization. What's the potential for the Anglosphere Western civilization more broadly to renew itself?
Well, this is the question. The potential should be great. The potential should be vast. And the reason for that is that we are more connected than ever before. We have better scholarship than ever before. We have a deeper and I think more accurate knowledge of the past than ever before. Our methods of textual criticism, or of philology, historical methods of it. I mean, the people like Alberti and Dante, Petrarch and company, they had none of these things. We should be able to do. We should be able to achieve the same kind of revival that we've seen many times in the past, much more easily. We should be able to, but we haven't so far, and we won't until we can make our peace with the past, and until we can convince ourselves once again or somehow rediscover that the past is a place of meaning and value for us. In the same way that someone like Dante, Petrarch, and company would have looked at the Roman ruins up and down Italy and thought, "Well, this is impressive. How did they do it? Maybe we can do the same thing. This makes me inspired to try to do the same kind of thing." In exactly the same way as the Arab conquerors of Persia and the Persian bureaucrats had the ancient Persian ruins right in front of their faces and thought, we should be great too. It's the same kind of impulse, and coincidentally the same kind of admiration of ruins, curiously. But the in the Western Middle Ages, where you have people like Charlemagne and Alfred the Great patronizing scholars who made copies of things, made copies of manuscripts, and shared them about and tried to enforce a higher standard of public learning and so forth. We have many examples that we know so much more about. We know more about the Roman past than they did. That's just a fact. So we should be able to draw on the same kind of source of energy and so forth.
Is this not what is so dangerous then about some of the chattering classes today? And I think they're in the minority on this, but not just the lack of respect for tradition in the past and learning from it and valuing it and building on it. It's that they actively attack it. And again, I don't think this is the majority of Canadians or the majority of Westerners. Hong Kongers, for example, value, capitalism and the rule of law, as I was told, in the British legal code, and anti-corruption efforts, British inheritances, and they value their past, and they don't see it as contradictory to Confucianism or Buddhism, but they become kind of individual rights-bearing agents, in part because of British influence, and in part because a lot of them have fled communism and then, find a repressive regime in Beijing now again. But, that sidewinder aside, isn't this the danger, though, in present-day Anglosphere countries anyway, where the chattering classes, from academics to universities, some in the media and politics, not only don't understand the past, don't want to learn from the past, they actively undermine and attack the past. And so that is the great danger. Even if 85% of Canadians would, prefer something different, they don't know how to find it, go about it, be inspired by it, and they're told by their betters, their supposed betters and rulers and others, that we must revolutionize and start from year zero and so on and so forth and discard the past. That seems to be a bit of a problem. And in the way of what you and I might hope is, yes, let's learn from the past, cherish it, build on it.
Yeah, so that is what stands in the way, right? And again, like the origin of civilization itself, we're dealing with a belief, right? It's fundamentally an outlook that needs to change. And now, having said that, I also note that the people who talk that way about the meaninglessness of the past, or if it's not meaningless, it's evil, or it's an example of just this uniformly bad story of oppression or something. Those people also tend to think that the solution to our problems presently is some kind of piece of technology or some kind of new revolutionary policy from the government,
well, indigenization of the past, or as opposed to, again, appreciating Indigenous history, and trying in some way to appreciate that past, and say the case of Canada, without tearing down the past of say John Stuart Mill, the rights of the individual and so on and so forth, or again this notion of discovering the culture of others and fashioning something new out of it. So again, sort of romanticizing someone else's culture and thinking that will save you, as opposed to, again, sort of building on the past of various traditions.
Yeah, romanticizing someone else's, that's ultimately a fantasy, right? We are not going to be saved by fantasies or by a utopian vision of of anything, vision of the future. But I mean, ultimately, what is going to make people happy or prosperous or well connected with one another, or feel rooted or attached to their communities, it's going to be the same thing that has always worked in the past. It's not going to be something new.
On that note, then, can you give one example each of clarity, beauty, and order, if it's possible to simplify it that much, that you think Canadians in particular, as part of the Western tradition and the Anglosphere, should rediscover?
Okay.
Big challenge at the last moment. It's a
okay. Clarity. Where we need clarity the most is in interpersonal communication. You have to assume that you're dealing with another human being whose experiences are not really going to be that much different from yours, and whose biology is fundamentally the same. We are all the same. We are one species. We have always been one species. We share a common humanity, and even just out of even basic respect, I think requires and demands that you treat your fellow human beings in such a manner that you presuppose that he or she will be able to understand you, and you the other.
So a belief in shared humanity, which is anti-identity politics, not to go down that road, but a belief in shared humanity, that the potential for evil and good is there in everyone.
Yeah. So I mean, I know that I know that someone else values his own culture as much as I value mine, and let's exchange as much as we can, and let's suppose that we're both equally capable and open to to communicating our individual and shared experiences together, because we definitely are.
And then beauty and order.
Beauty, harmonious proportion, structure. Our architecture, I think, is the way forward, because that's the simplest, easiest one. It is the most social art that we have, because human beings gather and work and listen to music, or read books together in buildings. Let's make public buildings. Let's build public buildings that meet our needs, that don't challenge them, that make us feel at ease and relax, and that foster harmonious social relations. If you build buildings according to the harmonious proportions described by people like Vitruvius or Palladio, you'll get there. Which is to name only two people. Like, there are many other architectural schools you might try. And order, the family, the household. Household is arguably an even better word than family, but the household of well functioning, organized people living and working together, raising children together, functioning as much as close as possible to an economic and social unit. This is the building block of a good society, and this is a universal principle presupposed by everybody from the earliest Mesopotamian states to Confucius to Aristotle and everybody. That's your smallest microcosm of order, and if you get that right, other things will follow.
Clarity, beauty, and order, and the order being the family unit. Not to go on a bit of a detour again, but at the last moment, I'm tempted to. It does seem like the collapse of the family in some cases in the United States explains in part, the murder rates or the violence, right? I mean, this has been talked about for 40 years, at least or 60 years, the collapse of the family and the collapse of fatherhood, right? Without father to impose order, you can sometimes be in trouble, right? Young males without a father are more likely to get in trouble, right? So is that an outward indication of the collapse of order, the collapse of the family unit?
Well, as a formerly young male, and now as a father, I can a father of three, very young people who, certainly they certainly have a tendency toward disorder, but having now that I see sort of both sides of it, I think, yeah, probably my generation could have done with a little bit more discipline. The structure of life that parents and as you say, specifically fathers can provide, I think, this is worth paying much more attention to than we do. And it's simply, I think it's a false assumption to assume that you could build a harmonious society in some new way that nobody ever tried before. And if you think it through, there's probably a reason why. I mean, there are limits to what we can, limits imposed by nature, by our biology that I think we should pay attention to. We should and that we should respect. And this is probably one of them.
I think that's an excellent place to end, Michael. And Aristotle, who this new think tank is named after, would agree with you vis-a-vis Plato that you can't be utopian and think you can have everybody take care of your children, or should. You actually need a basic family unit, right? People value what they own, so to speak, or what's in their sphere, and protect. So the family being a good example of that. If I interpret Aristotle correctly, and I think on that I do. So I've been talking with Michael Bonner in Defense of Civilization, How Our Past Can Renew the Present, published by Sutherland House. Michael, it's been a fascinating conversation. Thank you, and good luck with the book, and good luck with the necessary imposition of order on occasion with your children.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you, Michael. This has been the Aristotle Foundation's Interview with a Contrarian. I'm Mark Milkey, president of the Aristotle Foundation. Do check us out at aristotlefoundation.org. Make sure to buy Michael's book, In Defense of Civilization, and you can also check out the 1867 Project, which we recently published at the Aristotle Foundation as well. Have a good day, everyone.